The year was 1948. World War II had shaken the economic and social systems across South Africa and the world, but as most of the Western world was moving towards increased tolerance, framed by the Holocaust and other atrocities, South Africa stayed behind. The Liberal Unity Party was struggling with the more conservative National Party in a tug-of-war over the country's racial future. The National Party's victory, won by a tiny margin, would forever change South Africa's racial policies, and thus, apartheid was born.
We seek the gradual development of each of our groups in a certain direction.
White society met the influx of native blacks into traditionally white areas with political hostility.
One of apartheid's earliest and most oppressive laws was the Pass Law Act of 1952, meant to restrict black travel in white urbanized areas.
Booklets had to be kept by all black men older than 16. The South African government intended to have the books dictate every part of black life, required everywhere at all times. Passbooks would become ubiquitous, but as anti-apartheid symbols. They catalyzed the first major anti-apartheid protest. On March 21st, 1960, around 5,000 protesters assembled in the small township of Sharpeville to protest the passbook laws. Their nonviolent protest was met with a torrent of bullets. In less than 2 minutes, 69 people had been slaughtered and hundreds more injured.
Including a condemnation of the violence by the United States State Department.
Most of them were shot in the back as they were running away, protesting against the pass laws. I remember it as a moment when you realized that black life was cheap.
The Sharpeville massacre convinced the African National Congress, a fringe group of powerful black leaders, that nonviolence was no longer an option. One such leader, Nelson Mandela, created groups of young guerrilla fighters to challenge state-sanctioned violence and inequality with force.
Many people feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks.
Members of the African National Congress would not compromise with the government until equality was reached. In 1964, Mandela was charged with sabotage and sentenced to life imprisonment. His last public words before being locked away were,
"I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society. It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die."
His fellow half-citizens were just as committed to finding that freedom. The police state slaughtered dissenters of apartheid.
Black high schoolers in the town of Soweto would hold one of the many peaceful protests at that time against apartheid. They were against the mandatory language of Afrikaans in schools. While marching across the town, they were attacked by police. Thousands were sprayed with tear gas. Later, hundreds were sprayed with bullets and left to die in the blood-stained streets. There's not many photographs of the brutality because of the nature of the violence and South Africa's censorship of media.
The government there was really particular about censoring stuff. The local media, you won't see it on TV or any of the South African newspapers.
But this famous photo, in which Hector Peterson, a 12-year-old boy, lies dead in the arms of his fellow classmate, sparked horror across South Africa. The death toll today is recognized as 566 schoolchildren. Steve Biko, a freethinker who had been expelled from his high school for political activism, agitated the apartheid regime from a young age. After founding the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, the South African Students' Organization, and the Black People's Convention. He was found by a road, naked, shackled, and bruised. He had been arrested by the state and beaten to death, suffering a massive brain hemorrhage. No officers were found guilty.
These acts of terror were meant to paralyze the liberation movement. Instead, each ruthless attack only galvanized their resolve. These crimes also drew the eye of international news organizations. Anti-apartheid advertisements and protests were plastered across global media. Apartheid continued its march across South Africa, but domestic and international pressure made it falter. 4 days before parliamentary elections, eager protesters gathered in Cape Town with the intent to march on the Parliament building. Told to leave multiple times by police, blacks and whites joined together to resist. Police blasted the crowd with dyed water from their trucks. The color purple was meant to mark protesters for later arrest, betraying their involvement in the illegal rally. As bodies began to pour across the street in search of shelter, a brave man broke into the truck, coating everything and everyone in sight. Now every policeman, bystander, and politician was drenched purple, making it impossible to weed out the protesters. Finally, black or white skin did not matter, and all were equal. Perhaps this was a fitting metaphor for what was to come for South Africa. 4 days later, the National Party won the election again, but unlike his predecessors, F.W. de Klerk would usher in a new age of togetherness, bringing the end of apartheid to South Africa. He lifted the ban on the African National Congress and released Mandela and other political prisoners. During his presidency, he collaborated with the existing government officials and newly liberated leaders, including Mandela, on the production of new, progressive laws. In 1993, Mandela and de Klerk conjointly won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Black South Africans, however, could not simply forget the evils of apartheid. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee, a court-like body, aimed to repair the wounds between black protesters and white perpetrators. Victims came forward to share their tragedies. The offenders came forward to share their own, in exchange for amnesty. Among them, the police officers who had beaten and killed Steve Biko. The trials, in an inspiring display of forgiveness, helped mend post-apartheid injuries in South African society by reaffirming basic human dignity, something stolen 46 years before.
Opening wounds, cleansing them so that they do not fester.
But the wounds of apartheid were not, and are not, skin deep. Almost half of all blacks in South Africa today still live in grinding poverty, the legacy of apartheid's economic laws. According to a World Policy Report, South Africa's new economy lacks the stepladder positions to allow for the growth of the middle class, a flaw that keeps its society stratified by race. This is largely the fault of the African National Congress's inaction. The party of Mandela, Tutu, and Biko has today become the party of corruption. Desmond Tutu said of the ANC's current state, "I am glad that Nelson Mandela is dead. I'm glad that most of these people are no longer alive to see this." But with the recent resignation of corrupt President Jacob Zuma, South Africa looks to a new future. A future with all vestiges of the cruel apartheid regime erased from society, but never erased from history.
And saying we have dealt with our past as effectively as we could. We have not denied it. We have looked the beast in the eye.
So that South Africa can remember its tainted past and grow into a new nation built by all colors.